So thank you for joining me, Mark. I really
Sure.
appreciate it. What an honor.
What a pleasure. Earth gratitude woman. That kind of warms the cockles of my heart.
Yeah, I think you know what's interesting, and I want this to focus on you and your wisdom. I don't want to take it too long, but I think all of us have that in common. We want clean air, we want clean water, we want healthy food to eat. I think we get lost in the weeds of how to do it. This will be a statistic you might like. I read this. So I think it's something like over 90% of Americans are pro-environment, think it should be like the number one thing on our agenda.
Yeah.
But that includes about 18-20% Republicans.
Yeah.
Number one thing on the agenda, not number 2 or 5, number one. So, you know, I think that we're all closer together on this than we know.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, one thing that really gives me hope is I'm convinced at the core of every, at least healthy human being, there are a lot of pathologies and mental illness. We bond with nature. We love life. We bond with each other. That's the primary truth of our reality. Should I be talking at this screen?
Sure.
It'll be weird.
But you can look at me too.
You didn't want to use the actual courtyard?
You know, it's we could.
Okay.
We could. This is my standard screen. Actually,
Right.
where you are, which is where you are not, but where you are virtually is Highgrove, which is in England, and it's an organic farm owned by the Prince of Wales.
Cool.
So you're surrounded by what you love, even if we're surrounded by another thing that we all love, and it is gorgeous here. So we are at Synergia Ranch, and it's interesting because this kind of bookends quite an extraordinary career for you.
Oh, I don't know. It bookends. I think the future is unknown and open.
Yeah.
So,
well, at this moment, though.
At this moment, sure.
It is kind of a full circle back. And I want to ask you a little bit about your, because I think this is something that is unique to you. Not necessarily to you only, but it's not well known by a lot of people. Is the recycling that you've been able to do with black water. Do you want to describe that for us a little bit?
Well, this is something that actually came out of Biosphere 2, and it's kind of a nice story. So, you know, once you start to make a completely materially sealed world, a mini biosphere, then you come up against, you know, these very interesting realities and necessities. Like there can't be waste, there can't be wastewater. You have to figure out ways of keeping all the nutrients in the water regenerating, purifying the air, the food, the soils. So a colleague of ours, the co-designer of Biosphere 2, Phil Hawes, had heard of a guy named Billy Wolverton, who is this great maverick NASA scientist who was working at their Stennis Space Center just outside New Orleans in Mississippi. And he's a good old boy, loves to raise catfish, but he also has a PhD in chemistry. I think it's from Yale, from some institution like that. And he was a pioneer in the early 80s. Constructed wetlands were still a kind of innovative, push the envelope technology. And now they've kind of ramified and spread around the world. But it was just what we were looking for. How do we do something that's relatively low tech, completely ecological, doesn't need additives of chemicals or this, that, and the other? And so Billy helped Phil and Biosphere 2 people, designers, install this beautiful waste recycling system. So it wasn't just waste treatment, which it does very well, plants and their microbial agents, but we took the water from that constructed wetland and it went back into the irrigation supply from the farm. Mm-hmm. So it was a beautiful closed system. Everything that came out of the farm, animal products, crops, the waste products either went through that constructed wetland, sometimes directly from the animals. All of the human waste went there. Our laboratories and workshops went there to be purified, or the inedible material was composted. So Biosphere 2 is a very beautiful illustration of what we really should be looking at in the world.
And Biosphere 1?
In Biosphere 1, how do we help nature and use nature to solve our problems?
Yeah.
So it was kind of an introduction. You know, I had been a founder along with John Allen and Bill Dempster and Marie Hardy, et cetera, of the Institute of Ecotechnics, which is kind of the, you know, to my mind, the one of the spinal cords that holds together all of these manifestations that our group collectively and individually have done around the world. So we were working, you know, with the understanding that the two elements that had to be harmonized, we're going to have a good present and sustainable, beyond sustainable, regenerative future. We need to get our technology not making war and destroying and degrading our eco. That's both at the local level, at the intermediate level, and at the Earth's biosphere level. So ecological engineering was a parallel track that scientists, H.T. Odom, who I went after Biosphere 2 to do my PhD, there was a lot of people working in ecological engineering. And their insight was, you know, as we understand more about nature, let's use natural mechanisms to solve problems. So that's the eco, and the engineering is, let's figure out how to do this like engineers do in a cost-effective and efficient way. So I was the sewage manager of Biosphere 2, this New York City kid. And, you know, the associations that most people have, especially in the West, with sewage is well justified. They're kind of nasty. They're like a big factory, and enormous amounts of energy pump all the waste from really large cities to a handful, or even, you know, sometimes just one sewage treatment plant. They stink like hell. And at the end of the day, they take out a certain amount of the pathogens, they leave a lot of the nutrients, and they dump it back into the groundwater or the ocean or rivers. It's really sad. So after Biosphere 2, I was motivated, let's get a PhD in this field of ecological engineering. And for my PhD, we went back to Mexico where we had collected the corals for Biosphere 2. So it was a beautiful karmic payback. You know, we'll go back, and in that area, all of the ecotourism and the local populations had no sewage treatment. And the water was just going out and degrading coral reefs, and the tourists were coming down there and swimming with what they call brown trout. There's a euphemism. Yeah.
So just for the people that don't understand what a black water regenerative cycle can look like, can you just briefly tell us, like, okay, well, the sewage starts here and then it flows through XYZ?
Well, it's not just, I mean, if we can separate, okay, black water refers to like toilet flushes, and sometimes because of the oil and grease and food scraps from kitchen sinks, that's black water. And it's, you know, it has more pathogens, you know, it's definitely to be treated and taken seriously. But of course, you know, when you think biospherically or ecotechnically, you think any waste product is in fact a valuable resource for another system. So in Biosphere 2, it wasn't just the black water. Gray water refers to laundry, you know, sinks, you know, general wash up. In the case of Biosphere 2, it was also the urine and the wash down water of our animal bay, where we had our pigs and chickens and goats, and the wastewater from our laboratories and workshops. So all of that went there. And the first step, and it's typical if you're not connected to a huge sewage treatment plant, is we had the equivalent of septic tanks. So we had these tanks that were anaerobic, not to use too fancy a word, but basically, you know, a tank where there's very limited oxygen, And so a certain type of microbes and a microbial ecosystem begins the breakdown. Solids are separated, that's called primary treatment. Then in the case of Biosphere 2, by gravity feed from these septic tanks or anaerobic holding tanks, they were pumped through a series of interconnected, constructed wetlands. So this is where, a popular phrase actually makes sense, because people have understood that the wetlands of the planet, which are like almost everything else on the planet, is under great threat.
Yeah.
The wetlands are the kidneys of the earth.
Right.
And they have amazing properties, and they're usually near rivers or the interface of the land and the sea. That wetland plants and microbes have a great ability to take and detoxify toxins. So, we would pump this water. They were housed in 3 fiberglass tanks, and they were beautiful systems. We had floating plants, floating aquatic plants like water hyacinth and duckweed, but we also had emergent plants. An emergent wetland plant is one that has its roots in soil. So we, very simply put a bunch of soil in a series of burlap sacks, and this was a constructed wetland, and we kept that water there in general for 3 to 5 days, recirculating. And the plants grew luxuriously.
I'll bet they did.
And in Biosphere 2, again, nothing is wasted. So it was a great habitat for volunteer frogs who found it, and our ladybugs and other beneficial plants. And because Billy Wolverton is at heart a pretty ecologically minded guy, we had 17 different types of plants there. So there were beautiful flowering plants like canna lilies and a few different colors, etc. So it was really a joy to operate this system. So after the wetland, we had a UV sterilizer, but because all the biospherians, the crew that went in, we were tested and medically checked out to the nth degree, and we had basically shared all of our diseases amongst ourselves. So in fact, we never used the UV filter, because that's a non-chemical way of sterilizing wastewater. It was really unnecessary because we knew we didn't carry any infectious diseases. And then that water got mixed with water that we were collecting from transpiration, what the plants were releasing in evaporation. Biosphere 2 was an intensely packed semi-tropical world. It was really stuffed with life. So we collected the water that drained through our soils, our irrigation water, that was mixed with the transpiration water, and the small amount of water from our constructed wetlands. All the remaining nutrients went back to feed the farm soils. So it was an incredibly beautiful, fairly closed loop. And I remember, as the sewage manager, that I could kind of trace every pipe, and I knew where the water was coming, and I knew, like most people, the biospherians had more free time on Saturdays and Sundays, and there was more wastewater coming. Why was that? Because they were taking long showers or baths, and they were washing their clothes. So laundry also came into it.
Now, where was your drinking water coming from?
It was coming from the transpiration water, and we did have hydrogen peroxide as a way of sterilizing it, but it was very, very pure water. So among the wonders of Biosphere 2 is that, insofar as it leaked, and it hardly leaked or air exchanged at all, those were air molecules, which are really small. Normally when we build a building, we try to seal it so rain doesn't come in. So, pretty much 100% of the water that we began with in 1991, at the end of that first 2-year closure experiment, that was the water that we ended with.
So interesting.
We all grew up and had high school, the water cycle. So all of the cycles that keep our biosphere healthy and keep bringing water and nutrients where they're needed, etc., they were all present, but in Biosphere 2, sometimes we had to put in some technology to supply, because when you make even a 3-acre biosphere, you're excluding. We didn't have winds, we didn't have tides, so we had to have a tide machine in the ocean, and we had to have a fair number of pumps to pump the water around. But essentially, we had a water cycle. We had to have all those cycles. And the beautiful thing about Biosphere 2 is that all those cycles were incredibly accelerated. So it was no joke. This was like a reality. This was like part of a change of consciousness. Is we'd say, if we were stupid enough to pollute the water in this biosphere anywhere, it would be in our cup of tea within 2 or 3 weeks.
Mm. Let me ask you about the power to the biosphere. What were you using? I mean, you're in the middle of Arizona, so did you use solar? Did you use?
No, we wanted to. That was kind of a heartbreak. You have to go back. When Biosphere 2 was launched in 1984,
Right.
and we began construction. It's a really beautiful project. People ever go there, but go online and look at it, or
Yeah, I've been there.
read it. Yeah,
And I've been
it's
to
stunning.
Eden Project too, which I think is similar.
Inspired by it.
Yeah.
Tim Smith's a really good friend. I gave a talk there when I was promoting Pushing Our Limits, and I hope we have time to promote my books for your listeners and watchers who want to get deeper into the
Take a moment. You're the author
Sure,
of.
except that it's going to destabilize.
Well, you can also tell us what the names of the books are as
Okay.
well.
So there are 3 books that I want to talk about. One is The Wastewater Gardener. So when I went into the field of constructed wetlands, they were mostly pretty boring. They were reed beds, monocultures. And because my background is way more ecological than it is engineering, I said, let's make these systems beautiful, irresistible, so people fall in love with their wetlands and they put them in because it's going to be right outside their house or office or business or hotel. So we named them, and actually Deborah Snyder, who you already interviewed, she came up with the name, Wastewater Gardens.
Interesting.
So the Wastewater Gardener was the first of the trilogy of books I want to highlight. And I love the subtitle we came up with, Preserving the Planet One Flush at a Time. And it's kind of
it's eloquent, but not so beautiful. But anyway.
and there are alternatives to flush toilets. But the thing is that, it's sort of like anything. When you get into the story of black water, toilet waste, human wastewater, you find out that we're operating on really bad paradigms.
Yeah.
So the book not only, talks about my career with these systems. So, starting in Biosphere 2, actually starting with a beautiful chapter on the making of Synergia Ranch,
Mm-hmm.
which, can I say the word that starts S and ends with T?
Of course.
Okay, you can't say it on NPR, but so this ranch was built on shit. We had lots of animals. It was a little McDonald's had a farm.
Uh-huh.
And there was a racetrack that was operating just at the right time when we were planting 1,000 trees around the ranch and 500 fruit trees in our orchard.
Uh-huh.
So we went over, a horse wet weight, 15 tons of manure a year.
Wow.
So you get 1,000 race horses, even for a few months during a race. They were creating mountains of horse manure. Anyway, so Wastewater Gardener not only, traces that trajectory through Biosphere 2 to the enterprise and all the projects we've done around the world,
yeah,
but also looks at this problem because it's a huge tragedy that in the West, we treat sewage, shit, human shit, as a toxic, deadly, radioactive material.
Yeah, it seems very caveman that think of, like we didn't really progress beyond, because a toilet is kind of like just a fancy outhouse, right? Rather than, using our brains to, well, this could be much more.
Yeah, so it goes through a lot of the history of our thinking and also some contrasts, like traditional Asian agriculture, they in fact called it night soil. And that really is what our waste products are if they're properly composted and handled, etc. So we have a bad paradigm. Let me just finish that thought.
Yeah.
In the West, in countries with money, especially for cities,
Yeah.
where they will, spare no energy, expense, chemicals, etc., to send it basically to a factory where there's incomplete, detoxification, getting rid of the pathogens. And then all that fresh water and nutrients are basically just discharged.
And goes to the ocean or,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, in certain, so,
Rivers or ocean. And in the third world,
yeah,
it is the leading source of death in the world.
lack of water.
No, the pollution of potable water with badly treated or untreated sewage. The death rates among, third world, developing world, whatever you want to call it, poor countries, you know, diarrhea is a major killer. And then there's all the other waterborne diseases. So we have this very strange thing. And we've done a lot of our projects in the developing world because constructed wetlands, wastewater gardens are relatively cheap. They can be scaled up for a little complex of houses or a hotel to fairly big towns.
Let's just for the sake of people that are kind of going, oh, but the smell. I think we should talk about that for a moment because
Right.
I've been around these wastewater gardens, reed beds, whatever, and they don't smell.
No, yeah, and ours don't. I mean, we're really proud of that. And when we did our first tests in Mexico, with the systems we built that I did my PhD on, John Allen, when he'd come down, he would put a little deck chair and read a book right by the wastewater garden. And why he was doing that was it allowed the local people who were really nervous about the smell to come over, have a chat with John while they're and the secret to it is really very simple. We use subsurface flow wetlands and just a layer of 1.5 to 2 inches of gravel means that there's no exposed water, so there's no danger of kids playing in it, no mosquito breeding, and no odor.
Yeah.
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 Anyways,
And then the water out of the I'm calling it a reed bed. You obviously have a more sophisticated garden approach to it.
biodiversity.
Yeah.
Yeah, reed bed to me is just a tragedy.
Yeah. But
If
okay.
you're going to make a wetland, why not make it diverse and habitat for birds and animals and
So let's say it goes
flowers?
through the wetland area and it becomes a little bit more clean. It's still not
Dramatic.
drinkable yet.
No. And
But
that's
it
not
is,
my goal.
but it is at that point then able to do what? Like water the garden, or what's the second phase?
Yeah, which was an evolution in Biosphere 2. I didn't have to think about it because all of that constructed wetland went into the irrigation supply. And I realized that the paradigm, even for the engineers, was we do this constructed wetland, make it as boring as possible and efficient. This is the downside of some engineers. And then we'll say it's treated, and it's actually treated to a higher standard. We're all technophiles, I think, in the West.
Yeah.
And, so we always used to joke that we should have a lock box at the end of the system and pretend that there were all kinds of fancy instruments. No, it is the power of nature, of microbes and those plants,
Doing their thing.
doing incredible amounts of work, like we were talking about what natural wetlands do.
Yeah.
But, so it was an evolution in my thinking that what we should do without water, it is pretty clean for sewage water, but it's still got some remaining nutrients and fresh water.
Yeah.
Is let's create more greenery, landscaping. You can irrigate an orchard with it. Now, after the wetland, you're not limited to just plants that thrive in wetlands.
Right.
So there's been all kinds of permutations, and where we started doing our work was in the Yucatan Peninsula, and we created some of the most beautiful gardens in town because they have salty water there. It's kind of stressful, and my God, I mean, that's the thing about life. Life actually has solutions. So you give a plant and microbes what to us is, oh, that's that nasty stuff that comes out of our bathrooms. No, for them, it's like, oh, this is feast time.
Yeah.
So the really beautiful thing, and we've done projects in really dry areas like Algeria, etc. The outback of Australia for 6 months or 7 months has no rain. You're creating landscape beauty with all of the attendant psychological, ecological, emotional benefits without having to waste potable water.
Amazing.
So our goal quickly evolved to, let's try to use 100% of the nutrients and 100% of the water in a productive way. And it's a beautiful illustration of ecological engineering because you think about human communities and you think about nature. And usually, we kind of try to clean up our act after disasters happen. Constructed wetlands are a beautiful illustration of a buffer between human activities and the release of stuff into nature. So that's the first of the books. Second one, this is a book that I published with the University of Arizona Press 2 years ago, 2018. It's called Pushing Our Limits, Insight for Biosphere 2. And I finally realized, first off, it took me 25 years of digesting the experience of being in Biosphere 2 for 2 years. But I realized that there was no book that really tried to tell the story in a fresh way.
Yeah.
Because it's been so misunderstood. We can get to that. It was a great thing that it caught the world's imagination.
That's okay. Everybody can find out the misunderstandings on their own. Let's
anyway,
talk with the reality.
But pushing our limits. So I tried to really talk about what were our motivations in starting such a, I sometimes call it a kick-ass daring project, and that's an understatement. It was amazing. It was an amazing leap into the unknown. And it only turned out so successful because through 20 years of the Institute of Ecotechnics and having conferences, and when you're doing creative things, you find creative people. So we attracted a network of brilliant, ecologists, scientists, engineers from the micro level to the macro level to pull it off. And I also wanted to pull together all of the science, what was learned, what was the experiment really about.
Yeah.
So it was a really great pleasure to do that. And then the most recent.
And you know what, that one is going to be good for, right now we do have Spaceship Earth on Hulu, right? So that would be a good
platforms.
one.
And other
platforms. That would be a very, very good book to read maybe before, but certainly after. Whether you get introduced to it through the documentary or whatever, but I think that's a very good companion piece to that.
Yeah, and despite the fact that I suffered through and now have a PhD after my name, I don't like dry, terse academic writing.
Mm-hmm.
So I was pulling the science together, but really trying to tell it in a common sense and also human way, a personal way.
Good.
Because Biosphere 2 was not a university or government funded, with 10 layers of bureaucracy. It was actually another great illustration that a small group of people, of course, in that case, on that scale, with a very far-sighted, finance person, Ed Bass, who was a director of the Institute for 15 years. So that was.
And hasn't he just given another 30 million gift to the U of A to keep it going?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, this is very long term.
Yeah. And Biosphere 2, it's great even in its controversy because, the sad fact is that a lot of science is so constricted by these taboos. One of the taboos was, is it legitimate science to study how humans and technology interact with the living world? And apparently that's a taboo. It's just amazing. I hope it isn't now. Because when you think about what we really need, world science and people and common sense and entrepreneurs and every level we can think of, this is the question of our time. And, so we were told when we built Biosphere 2 that we're 50 years ahead of the curve, ahead of our time.
That's okay. Maybe you pushed humanity faster in the direction it needs to go.
Well, this was the great thing that we caught the world's imagination, which was a great surprise. It was supposed to be a quiet R&D project in a fairly non-touristy part of southern Arizona. You've been there.
Yes.
For 6
it's
months.
It's a very non-touristy part.
Unknown caller.
for 6 months of the year, it's almost like being on the surface of Venus. But at that time, most people didn't even know how to spell the word biosphere. And Biosphere 2, and this is pre-internet. This is the old-fashioned satellite, vans that they up. Close to 1 billion people watched the re-entry of us coming out, after the 2 years. So I occasionally in my wastewater garden and other activities get to really remote places. I've been stunned, like I'm thinking in what am I thinking? In the state of Oaxaca, actually. In the state of Oaxaca, I went with a friend who was a grad student at the University of Florida to this little village. And, because I like to tell my story and inspire people, I gave this slideshow for a whole bunch of mainly very indigenous Mayan and Spanish speaking, Mayan Indians.
Mm-hmm.
And they, as soon as I started doing the show, they recognized the images. Somehow the images of Biosphere 2 had gone up to this little mountain. They were innovating with organic coffee, place that was a birthplace of my Mexican friend. And that blew my mind. It's like, so anyway, so we permeated that, but the really interesting thing at this point in time is that the world is caught up so much with what we were doing that if we built Biosphere 2 now, people would immediately understand its significance.
Absolutely.
It's an experiment in can humans figure out how to do what they need to do, farm, technology, not for Mars, but living on Earth.
Wow. Well,
we have to
the reason I'm saying for Mars is that I went to NASA recently, and they have a goal of getting humans on Mars by, I think, 2030. What, 10 years away, maybe 12 years away. So, I mean, it's very, very relevant.
Well, yeah. And Biosphere 2 is a tricky one to compress to a soundbite because there are two major, objectives. And one is, as you're pointing out, to start learning how to make and what the problems are and what we know and don't know about creating mini biospheres. Because if we're going to live, not just, have a picnic and subsist for 3 or 6 months on places like Mars, we need to have a complex ecological system around us for ecological safety, for the human heart.
Yeah.
Can you imagine living in a world where you only have hydroponic wheat and potatoes, and 5 other food crops, and the food engineers have figured out how to make a diet?
You
can do that, as an endurance test, but will you live and thrive?
I think it's interesting because, and when I was talking to John a couple of days ago, I said, how can we protect our planet? And he said, the first thing I think we should realize is that our planet protects us. And so like all the things that we're studying or all the things we're reconnecting with, Mother Nature has already constructed for us. We're just trying to understand it better or work better with this amazing planet that we find ourselves on. And that's why I kind of loved Spaceship Earth as the name of the documentary, to think of us more as like these astronauts on this beautiful planet. We could have been a blip of consciousness on another sphere, and here we are on this beautiful, luxurious Eden, really.
No, yeah. So to finish that, so there's the space, but the other purpose of Biosphere 2 was a new kind of biospheric level laboratory, experimental ecology on a scale that's relevant to our global issues.
Yeah.
And, so what convinced me, I was the director of the project, I was the director of space and environmental applications, to, seriously start training to become a biospherian, is I had 24 hours in our little test module. And we did that, to test how to seal a system, do the space frames, and we did all kinds of ecological experiments in there. Then John was the first vertebrate. He was in for 3 days, and he flourished. And 2 other people stayed in for 7 and 21 days. And we said everyone on staff should go and have an experience like this. Now, I had been working in ecology for I don't know, 16, 15, 16 years before that. Within 5 minutes, my entire understanding of the human situation and our relationship to the world of life changed. Because instead of it being these thought forms, rattling around your brain, your body suddenly understands. And in a small world, you look around and you can see all of the green plants that are, feeding you oxygen and purifying the air and the water. And that, so that understanding becomes cellular, becomes visceral. It's hard for me, and I wish there was an elegant way. I think we need to set up situations where people have this experience.
Sleepovers at Biosphere 2
Yeah. Well,
by Mark Nelson, book number 4.
We'll get to book number 3 in a minute. But the thing is that, so people were just learning the word biosphere.
Yeah.
And I think it's still, I think there's a, percentage, certainly, a lot of people are really woke to the danger of our situation.
Yes.
But it needs to start with, like you're saying, we are being protected. Our life support system, when they send astronauts out, there's oxygen tanks and water recycling, and they put the food on board. If we didn't have a biosphere, we would die in our next breath. We would be instantly dead. What was that?
Sobering.
Sobering and also joyful. You're part of it. So this is why, instead of calling the crew inside bionauts or econauts, someone came up with the term biospherian, and it was so perfect. And of course, with the good intent, Pronoia, woman who runs our Puerto Rico project, was a Zippy in London. So have you heard of Pronoia? So we know what paranoia is, and I'm going to give that definition. Pronoia is the sneaking suspicion that people around you are plotting to do good things for you. So pronoia is to realize that the earth and all of its living organisms, from the unseen to the, elephants and whales, etc., this is our life support system. This is no joke. So what we're doing by being callous and trying to looking at the earth as a resource to make money with or have a convenient life, if we degrade that life support system, we're involved with kind of a suicidal and insane mission. So when people say, what's the first thing that I should do? First thing you should do is get out of the fantasy that there's an environment outside you. There is no environment outside you. You are part of the biosphere. Every breath you take, every drop of water, every bit of food has been, prepared for you by the biosphere. And similarly, go back to the sewage system, all of your wastes are eagerly awaited by, the natural forces and functions that can recycle it. And so Stephen Jay Gould, who is kind of a beautiful guy, he actually gave, Stephen Jay Gould?
Yes.
He is fairly famous archaeologist, punctuated equilibrium. He wrote columns for the Smithsonian. Really brilliant guy, beautiful writer, wonderful books about nature, etc. He actually gave the keynote speech when the second crew of biospherians went in. But I love a quote of his. It says, "Unless we fall in love with the earth, we will not fight to defend it. Because we only fight and really get engaged if we love something." So love is, love is like an action term. And it's also like, my partner is a psychologist, and when I started hearing about nature separation syndrome and all these things, the last kid in the woods, it's like, and I'm a New York City kid, but I also remember going to Central Park or Prospect Park or the beautiful parks in Queens where I grew up. Put your inveterate city person into a park and they will respond. They can sense the beautiful.
Park is beautiful.
Yeah,
It's beautiful. I have to ask.
So greening our cities is also crucial.
It's very crucial. I just saw a study that said that the redlined areas in cities can be up to 13 degrees hotter because of all of the concrete and the lack of trees and
Yeah.
cover. So I would agree. I want to ask, because I think this is,
Okay, we're going to do the trilogy though.
we
The
are, but I
third-
have, before we get off biosphere, let me just ask you this.
No, this is going to continue.
Okay.
My most recent book is
Yeah.
the second edition of Life Under Glass with a new subtitle called Crucial Lessons in Planetary Sustainability. And the real fun thing about this is this was a book that I and Abigail Alling, the marine biologist inside Biosphere 2, and Sally Silverstone, who's in charge of the food systems and also our co-captain, we wrote that book even before we came out of Biosphere 2. So for people, who, read about it or see Spaceship Earth and what was it like to be a biospherian? That is like a firsthand
Chronicle during the time.
chronicle, of what it was like. And I remember saying we should write a chapter on a day in the life, stealing the title from an old Beatles song, because I know, with the passage of time, as vivid as that experience is, you forget.
Yeah.
So we followed all of the biospherians on a certain day in June of our second year inside.
Oh,
And it's
wonderful.
fascinating because you really get a sense, what does it mean to be a biosphere? When we went in, that was just a term. How do we learn to actually function as a cooperative, conscious cooperative agent with the world that we've been put in charge of? So it's a beautiful analogy, I think, to the challenge for humans now.
And it actually leads into the question I was thinking of asking you, which is 8 people, a visionary financier, visionary leader. But how do you, were you paid? What it was the glue that kept it all together?
Oh, the glue. It's not just Biosphere 2. I'm laughing because we have a French friend who's made a couple of 3 beautiful films, Michel Decouste, and I'm sure I can't nail her French accent. But she was talking not just Biosphere 2, but this whole trajectory and how there are people that are still working
Together.
40 years later.
Yes.
What is the glue that holds it together? And I think it's shared purpose and commitment. Because, okay, ethnically, the second, I do want to say, and I got laughter when I saw the film up at Sundance. Yeah, we had a Belgian, 2 people from the UK, and 5 Americans, 2 Jews, etc. But the second crew actually had 2 Mexicans, a Nepalese agriculturalist, and a woman from Australia. So Biosphere 2 started to get much more ethnically diverse.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that, what really holds together small groups of people is a shared vision.
Yeah.
And I'll go back to when I first came to, and my heart is always in 5 places, but certainly one is right where we are at Synergia Ranch, because I came here as an overeducated, Ivy League graduate, city kid, and I learned ecology at the ranch and how to work with people and build buildings and do things that I didn't think just ordinary people could do, that you have to call in the professionals.
What was your degree in?
Philosophy.
From what's your alma mater?
Dartmouth.
Ah, and so, but that's interesting because
But I also did pre-med because that was my doom. The Jewish family wanted as many medical doctors as possible. My brother did that.
So it might not have been the popular choice from your family's perspective for you to come out here.
No, my father died when I was 16. My mother never understood it, but she loved it. When we made the front page of the New York Times, when Biosphere 2, when we first,
she must have been so.
So at least she saw, she didn't really understand. She came out here and she said, "Oh, I get it. You guys are utopian socialists." No, we're not utopian socialists. We actually believe in free enterprise. And I ran a landscaping company, a wood shop with a partner. We believe in working hard and playing hard. Is another great. But what I was going to say, what really endeared me when I came here, was I really feel for kids. How can you choose a career? And should I become a philosopher, a doctor, a lawyer, an Indian, a fireman, a baker? When I came here, they said the program, and this is from Mr. Visionary John Allen and the group had been working for a couple of years before I arrived in October '69. They said we do three things kind of concurrently. We run enterprises, so you learn something from beginning to end and you support yourself. We do theater, which is a wonderful way for group dynamics and psychological work, but also, we're all artists and we want to express ourselves. And, as I worked in theater for the next 30 years or so, my understanding, we're doing theater now. It's called the theater of an interview with a traveling gypsy who goes to interview. No, so there's theater in life, there's theater on the stage. And when we did our projects around the world, every project had a theater. We did outback comedies that we improvised, along with doing Brecht and Artaud and Shakespeare and whatever, for Aboriginal and outback redneck, kind of Australian redneck audiences. And the third thing that we do is we work on ecology. So wherever we are, we want to, one, integrate with the local cultures and communities. And from the beginning, we've had great relationships. And New Mexico is a beautiful place because it's got a very ancient and very vibrant Native American culture, mainly Pueblos here, but Apaches, and etc., and very deeply Hispanic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always been a magnet. Santa Fe is a wonderful place because it's always been a magnet for kind of the creative, offbeat, spiritually inclined Anglo. So they truly say it's a land of three cultures. But when I heard that program, it was like, great, I don't have to choose like I'm in a Chinese menu for one entree and maybe I'll have a soup and a dessert. No, why not live a balanced life?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part of the problem around the world is that we're not made to sell ourselves to jobs, especially if it's a job that you're basically doing so you can feed you and your family or loved ones and pay the rent.
Mm-hmm.
This is a wrong model for human beings. This is not designed to nurture our inner child and our aid our development. So, although we always avoided terms like communes and counterculture because we didn't want to be labeled.
Right.
And that was a heyday, 1969. It was a hotbed of alternative communities in New Mexico.
If you were to give it a label, what would you give it?
I'd say a fresh approach at how to live a human life, a satisfying human life. So, my issue, and I love, Matt Wolf for initiating it, Stacey Reese and Stanley Bucknall, two of the producers. I love that they made Spaceship Earth. And, there's only so much you can do in a 2-hour movie.
Right.
So there was a lot of emphasis on theater of all possibilities, not enough on Institute of Ecotechnics.
Right.
And without understanding Institute of Ecotechnics, it seems haphazard. Why do you have a project in Puerto Rico working on sustainable forestry in the tropics? Why do you go to really difficult, and I love the place, Birdwood Downs, you buy 5,000 acres of completely worthless, degraded tropical savanna. Why do you build a ship? It's not going to make you a lot of money, but if you really want to understand the planet, these are the things you do. And why?
How long did you spend on that ship? I mean, that seems so extraordinary. And also, how many people were sailing around with you? What did you do with the wastewater in the ship?
Well, I actually was trying to get some. I was only on the Heraclitus for about 3 months. I went out there. I was helping keeping the ranch. I was planting the orchard when the Heraclitus was happening. But that's another one. And the other thing when I speak to audiences, especially young people, is you're suffering because our culture likes you to lower your expectations of what you can do and what a collective, small group of you, friends, community can do. And I think it serves the powers that be to kind of make people feel impotent. Oh yeah, all I can do is.
Can I want to ask you a little bit more about the model though, because inside the biosphere, at that point, and this kind of is okay. Now you are in a system where you can't be the entrepreneur, you cannot be the enterprising person that is earning your own. At that moment, did it feel different? Were you accumulating a salary or something? Were you a
Yeah.
little bit more like a normal person? And how did that feel? Because you only had 2 years of it and then you came out, or
Well, you know, the thing about enterprise, and you know, when I first came to the ranch, you
yeah,
know, I had done all kinds of jobs after graduation. I was a taxi driver, a social worker, you know, I worked in the Time Life building, proofreading really terrible Time Life books, etc. You know, so when I heard, oh, enterprise, you know, my first thought is maybe I'll become a guard at the prison. Bad idea. If the question is, are you going to pull a trigger on an escaping prisoner? And I'm not ready to either do that or even answer the question, or become a taxi driver. So enterprises can be done at different levels.
yeah,
So, for example, in Australia, our entire project there was an enterprise. You know, and we produced you know, climatically adapted seeds to regenerate the savannas. We made hay. We sold horses and bred horses and turned off cattle and had a nursery. And you know, so the enterprise can be a collective one. So Biosphere 2 is best understood as an enterprise.
yeah,
And the reason that Ed Bass was willing to put his money in is that we thought that we could recoup the investment and more by spin-off technologies, you know, because we had to do a lot of innovative things, and also, frankly, by selling biospheres to Euro Disney and you know, cities where there really are gazillions of people who come, like London or
yeah,
Tokyo, New York or San Francisco.
right,
And unfortunately, that you know, because the media, you know, kind of made us a tar baby, that kind of ruined some of those prospects. So you mentioned that I was also at Eden. It kind of knocked my socks off. And Tim Smith is the first to say this was inspired by Biosphere 2. And I love the theme of Eden. I'm sure you heard this, is this to illustrate and make people see the symbiosis, the cooperation between people and plants. Well, Biosphere 2, in a way, was an incredible symbiosis to show people. And remember, let's go back 25 years when even the word biosphere was esoteric and the word sustainable was not in common parlance and eco was not on every breakfast, you know, cereal and falsely
I
green.
feel like it was there. I mean, I think a lot of people forget that Carter put solar panels on the White
True.
House.
And the
I
first thing that Reagan did was take them off.
it was, but I'm just saying is that, you
Yeah,
know, this,
sure.
you know, it's important for especially anybody who's going to judge us that we were not all part of forgetting about
No.
eco.
And Kyoto, you know, unfortunately not ratified by the US, was in 92.
Yes.
It's just that, you know, now I think the crisis has gotten so great and the wake up factor.
Yeah.
The wake up factor is such that, you know, what were, you know, tangential, you know, people did not go to sleep aside from a few, you know, worried about global climate change. I mean, I'm worried about global climate change. I'm more worried about the assault and degradation of our biosphere, and
Yeah.
that we're losing rainforests and mangroves and on and on and on and on
Yeah.
and on.
I mean, I think before the science was out there about climate change, those of us that were concerned about the environment were just looking at our relationship with nature and saying, you know, plastic, which is not biodegradable, doesn't seem to be a good thing to put your food in. You know, I don't like the idea of McDonald's because I'm sorry to use that name, folks, but, you know, I didn't like the idea of getting something in a paper bag and then throwing it away. You know, we didn't believe in single use. We could see a problem with putting everything in plastic. So it wasn't based on the science of climate change. It was just based on common sense, really,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, I like to point out, you know, when people, you know, say, oh, organic gardening, farming, I don't know if it can feed the world. I mean, if you go, the Industrial Revolution, you know, we need to have a perspective on things. The
Yeah,
Industrial Revolution was only in the early 1800s. So we're barely 200 years into the Industrial Revolution. And every farmer in the world, and a hell of a lot more of us were farming, we're doing it organically. But don't tell me that organic farming can't feed the world. And of course, there are other issues like Can we get population under control? Can we be more efficient? You know, the other thing is I don't like the deep ecologists or other people, and I've heard this so often, who just regard humans as a cancer and parasite on the planet. That may be true, but that is not our essential role here.
Right.
We are, children of the biosphere. We are, amazing
Cognizant
products
beings.
of evolution. If you love, what am I going to say here? Saguaro cacti and dolphins and elephants, and you should love human beings because we're a remarkable agent. It's just like, we are literally like kids, in a little nursery who figured out how to make these techno gadgets. And we're all enamored with our work, and we're smearing the shit all over the walls. And, it's really kind of a mess.
Yeah.
But this is a temporary transient phase. And I think the other really important message is that people should not lose hope, optimism. That doesn't mean that you ignore what's going on.
Right.
And so you could be terrified and optimistic.
You can see a problem and find a solution.
Yeah. And we are survivors. Microbes are survivors. We're here with our DNA and our phenotypes because, we're the latest in a successful evolutionary line. And we're going to figure this all out. And so what I loved about Biosphere 2 is that it touched into the history of science. And there's a whole other thing, and maybe we need to continue on another Zoom, because it touches back to the Anthropocene. Vladimir Vernadsky, who we had the great fortune of discovering, he was pretty unknown, it's still pretty unknown in the West, but he was the great modern thinker of the biosphere. And so the Russians and all Eastern Europeans not only know Vernadsky, who said, we're not just passengers, life has transformed the Earth. But he also could see the problem that our technology, our ability to move matter and be kind of dumb about it, meant that we had to get intelligence. So if you know the term noosphere, the sphere of intelligence, he and two other people in Paris he was teaching at the school, he said that's the next stage of evolution. So maybe instead of the Anthropocene, we should say it's the noosphere, where humans learn to regulate ourselves. We're not in charge of the biosphere, thank God. Just like you and I are not in charge of all of the automatic functions that keep us this incredible assemblage of organs and atoms and all that stuff going.
We try to assist.
But we're powerful enough that we have an obligation, we have a necessity, because we all want to live a good life, and I think we all want other people to live good lives.
Yeah,
and now you can't really sit on the sidelines. But let's start modest. Let's start with break the fantasy that the biosphere is part of an environment outside of you. And then start to love it. Love your houseplants. Love the tree outside your window if you're quarantined. Start to love, things that you can identify and experience that. I mean, hug a tree. Go into a park. I mean, I think every city in the world has got a green area, getting greener.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice. Is that your last word?
For this moment, yeah, because we've blown past my
45 minutes?
45
Do you
minutes.
want, I was going to suggest if you want, you could just hold up each book one at a time.
Sure.
I'll swap them out here.
Yeah, it'd be nice for people
All right,
to see.
if you can grab them.
All right.
And then I'll put this, and you can probably see very easily. And again, just real quickly, you can show it.
This is the Wastewater Gardener, preserving the planet one flush at a time. This is Pushing Our Limits, with a beautiful cover image of the Biosphere 2 lit up at night. And then that new edition of the book 3 of the Biospherians wrote, The Inside Story, Life Under Glass, second edition, Crucial Lessons in Planetary Sustainability.
Ah, so grateful. Okay, I'm going to stop this. And thank you, thank you, thank you. Today is
Sure.
September 7th, 2020.
I would ordinarily do something like
we'll
that.
do it the Indian way. Okay, I'm going to stop this. Hang on.
And I'm going to call Starlight, who may be bunching down.